Hey, Dan, sorry, I'm still on the road this week, but really glad we could hook up via Zoom.
Oh yeah, it's no problem. But listen, I got to tell you, since you've been away so much, I've started dreaming about you.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, I'm afraid to ask, but what are your dreams about?
Well, in my dreams, we're in the CGNU studio, deep within the concourse below the Fairmont Hotel. We're sharing a coffee, we're trading one-liners with producer Adam, and we're happy. We're also happy, and we're being funny, and we're having such a good time.
That actually sounds pretty nice. So you're really dreaming about me?
No, I'm not dreaming about you, dude. I'm tired of doing these chats via Zoom. I want you back in the studio because when you and I get face to face, that's when the magic happens.
Okay, my bad. I've just been traveling. It's been crazy, been all over the place. I'll be home soon.
Okay, well, that's good because if I ever start dreaming about you, I mean, really dreaming about you and all the good times we had on the podcast when you were in town, the Lone Ranger may actually become the Lone Ranger.
The Winnipeg Free Press proudly presents, in partnership with CJNU 93.7 FM, Nigan and the Lone Ranger. Here are your hosts, Nigan Sinclair and Dan the Lone Ranger Lett.
Do you ever notice how we threaten each other a lot in the opening segments? So that happens to be
There is kind of a residue or a shadow of violence occasionally in our
a latent hostility. Like I don't actually resent the fact that you're much in demand and you're traveling the country. I'm maybe a little envious, but
well, don't be envious of where I am right now. Right now, I'm in Port Elgin, Ontario, actually in a small town called Chesley. And I'm with a couple hundred teachers in a school district down here. The people of the ministry, from the Ministry of Education's here. It's not all that exciting when you're completely surrounded on four sides of you with farms and dandelions.
Okay, so city boy, like now that we're both identifying this, modify, yeah, way to go, way to out us for our rural audience that we're both city boys. No, but you also got to spend a little time in Toronto, right? And you did some cool stuff there.
Yeah, I'm on sort of a mini tour of South Ontario, sorry, but I was in Hamilton, and that's where I was, and then down near St. Catharines, a little bit in Niagara, working with teachers and other groups down there. But I got a chance to go to. Well, I was here during the Great Leafs loss, but I'm not going to bring that up for you.
No, we're not talking about that.
But I did happen to get to see the Eastern final of the National Lacrosse League, which is weird because it's the Toronto Rock, but they play in Hamilton. And not only is that kind of weird, a reminder that Toronto's colonizing everywhere, but then second is that they lost, but the Toronto team has no Indigenous players for lacrosse.
Whoa. Wait a minute here. Even like I've never seen. Well, I did see some professional lacrosse way back in the day. Like my dad happened to be friends with a guy who, for a time, was the head coach of the New Westminster Salmon Bellies, which is a very venerable professional lacrosse organization on the West Coast. And I did get to see it. My recollection was, A, it's crazy. Like it's absolutely nuts watching professional lacrosse. But B, even I know that the best professional lacrosse players are Indigenous. How could they have no Indigenous, like they have to go out of their way to have no Indigenous players?
It is remarkable because not only does Toronto not have any Indigenous players, I mean, they're a good team, but they lost to the Buffalo Bandits. No, now the Buffalo Bandits are in the National Lacrosse League final, I think against Calgary, I think. But the Buffalo Bandits have two Indigenous players, both from Ontario, both Mohawk or Haudenosaunee, and the most remarkable player, and I encourage everybody to check him out. His name is Tahoka Nanticoke, and man, that guy is out of control. He's from Six Nations in Ontario. He scored, I think, 4 goals out of the 17. Buffalo just totally wrapped the floor with Toronto and won the Eastern Conference final. 17-8. But I mean, it was amazing watching this Nanticoke player. He was unbelievable. And the fact that about a third of the crowd was Indigenous as well, and most of them were supporting Buffalo. It was a very sort of surreal situation, but again, Toronto lost, and I don't want to just continue to belabor the point. I'm actually starting to feel bad for people from Toronto right now.
Okay, well, moving on.
I like how every time I bring up
no, moving on. It's like, I will just say this, okay? And this is the last word that we will say
the first
about anything.
And the last that you've said.
The first and the last words about the Toronto Maple Leafs is that every year, the only truth in professional hockey is that there are 32 teams in the NHL, and 31 of them don't win the Stanley Cup final, period, paragraph. Moving on now. So on a more, it is a more serious but intriguing note. So I've got to tell you, I didn't know how to act or react when the feasibility study came out with up to $184 million to search the now out of service landfill north of Winnipeg to see if there possibly could be more remains of the serial killer's victims. But Ottawa, which is that's the journalistic term that we use, short form for federal government, appears to be supportive in general. I don't know if they're going to support that exact number, but it seems that like the Prime Minister came out and said that in the face of that number being posted, we're going to do whatever we can to help. Tell me, like, what do you think's going on? Like, this could be, I don't know. This has got to be exponentially more expensive than any other forensic search, criminal search that's ever taken place in this country. Maybe it's time.
Both of us have over the weeks studied this issue, and the real issue at the Prairie, I always get this name wrong, the Prairie Green landfill, the one that's probably under the most amount of investigation, never mind the other issues that are going with the two landfills. But the issue is pretty simple in that the police know that or have said they suspect there are the remains of at least two women there. And that means that they've acknowledged it. There's $184 million of an estimate to say up to 3 years of investigation. So this would be, anyone who sort of studies the issue knows that there's two major things involving landfills, and particularly the Prairie Green landfill, which is that it's very heavily packed down. And as a result, that's not an excuse, but that's a reality that to do any extraction or any investigation is very labor intensive work. It's likely $184 million is conservative in terms of how much that would take. Think of it in terms of they're doing any kind of investigation of this magnitude is not just about digging, but it's also all the other things, the archaeologists, the researchers, the transport, just the funding of keeping the 24-hour task team out there to protect the site. Never mind, on top of that.
Yeah.
So all you really need to know is that the Indigenous community has been demanding this. There was a very passionate description by the survivors at the press conference. And, while there's been the findings of Rebecca Contois, Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron and famously known as the Buffalo Woman, there's no sight of where they are. And if you know where they are, then I think everyone would agree that something should be done about it. The feasibility study, I think, is kind of a perfect example of this issue as a whole, which is that when Canada deals with it so late, or when police officers mishandle the issue, meaning use terms like it's not feasible, then you get this situation. When you have a lack of sensitivity that comes from the very beginning, from the very highest echelons of the police, when you have a government that has the 231 calls for justice but won't move on them very speedily or rapidly, and then provincial governments that tend to turn a blind eye. Heather Stephenson's government, like most provincial governments in the country, has just moved nowhere on the issue of murder missing Indigenous women and girls. You get a serial killer who creates the situation, and we all now have to inherit and clean it up in some way.
My original thought, like the first thing I did when I saw the story on the feasibility study, and then I read some of it, was how long were they searching Robert Picton's farm in BC? I think that is an investigation that could inform how we should view this. The dates are a little fuzzy, but I think it was essentially a 2-year investigation. And it involved forensic archaeologists and, academic specialists in this area, 2002, 2003. And the BC government estimated the cost at that time, 20 years ago, at $70 million. So I'm not smart enough to do the inflation adjusted dollars calculation. I never have been. But okay, so like to tell you the truth, now that helped me sort of see that the number that's being floated right now may not actually be an extraordinary number. I think it is a number that could have been smaller if we had developed a protocol that as soon as they found some remains, or as soon as they realized that there was a location where the remains were likely, that there should have been an instantaneous move to shut the place down. My understanding from talking to the provincial government is that the company has been very cooperative. Like they have been, and they are actually willing to consult on the investigation, which, I mean, I don't think you can really ask more from the private company that owns the landfill. But, it is, and I mean, it's, unfortunately, it's become, the story of the way the Winnipeg police interact, saying the wrong thing right away, not saying the right things until some time has passed, not taking actions.
Often inflaming the issue as it goes along. Like I wrote in my column that the attempt to try to talk about, Indigenous women as an issue always comes across so badly by the Winnipeg police. Yeah. I think for the most part, because the relationship has become so acrimonious and so toxic, that Indigenous women don't want to appear with the Winnipeg police. But if you could somehow figure out how to repair that relationship, so many things could be dealt with in a much more effective way.
I mean, skepticism that comes from repeated behavior at the hands of an institution, you can't expect it, in a year or a couple of years, because really the Winnipeg Police Service has to start demonstrating that it has new sensibilities. It's developed new instincts and muscle memories around these cases. Until they've done that, basically everything they do, and we've seen this in other cases where they've come out very quickly and delivered an opinion about an investigation or a case, and the reaction is, well, we don't like, why would we listen to you? We really don't trust you. This is an interesting segue, actually, to our interview this week, which really,
100% that, it's not I think it's related that there's one of the bigger issues that we're dealing with is justice. And I can remember a few years ago, before the pandemic, before the dark times, in my early days of working at the Free Press, being invited to spend some time with you socially. And we happened to see this person who I got to meet and spend some social time with. And I really appreciated his insight. And I'm really glad that he was willing and able to come on the podcast here. You had an opportunity to interview the Honorable Kelvin Goertzen, who's the representative from Steinbach. He's the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General. And he's also responsible for the Manitoba Public Insurance Corporation and the Government House Leader and so on. But, I know him most of all of, guy that's just willing to sit there and talk to you about almost anything. Like, I've really appreciated talking with Kelvin Goertzen, and regardless of where you're from or whether you're media or not, he's a pretty open and frank guy. And so we're real lucky to have him on the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously known Kelvin for a long time, ever since he entered politics. I mean, really, it doesn't really matter political stripe. Kelvin could teach a masterclass on how politicians should interact with the media. He's confident, he's well informed. I obviously don't agree with everything that he says or does, but he doesn't hide from people in the media. He doesn't inherently mistrust us. You have to earn his mistrust, is the way I like to put it. But no, like he actually makes the point that in all of his years, he doesn't believe he's been badly treated. In all the interviews that he's done, he says he's maybe been misquoted once, and even then, it was mostly just a misunderstanding. And I think that his example, I wish he was more of an example to a provincial government, which quite frankly is not emulating Minister Goertzen's example when it comes to media relations. We had a chance to talk a little bit about MPI, which I've written a lot about, and which he is the minister responsible for, and also about the recent debate about bail conditions and whether or not we should make it harder for certain kinds of accused persons to obtain bail. And it's a fascinating conversation and somewhat amusing at times, I would say. And so now let's go to our feature interview with Justice Minister and Attorney General and former interim Premier, I might add, Kelvin Goertzen. If you're keeping track at home, and I know many of you are, Kelvin Goertzen is the second Minister of the Crown from the Progressive Conservative government to appear on the podcast. Apparently now that we've broken the seal, they're lined up to get in. I'm beating them off with a stick, Kelvin.
I wonder how I ended up being second, though. But I know. I mean, Rochelle was well deserving as being the first one. But it's good to be here with you, and so you don't have to fly solo. We should take our shtick on the road, maybe, if this goes well.
Yeah, I'm thinking that we could do stand up at the Smitty's in Steinbach.
Oh
for
yeah,
sure.
that'll go over really well. That'd be good.
That used to be the. I had for a period of time a number of chance meetings. If I'm not mistaken, you like to take your mom there.
I do. Well, I mean, my mom, we just like to go anywhere, right? When we can have that time. So, yeah, I do. I like to take my mom there, and sometimes there's so many options now in Steinbach. It's different now, right? It's grown and everything. But, hey, anytime you can take your mother out for coffee and she's still alive and doing well, you consider that valuable time.
That sound effect was me knocking on wood.
Yeah.
And, for sure. Well, thanks for being here. And, honestly, it's kind of hard to pare down what to talk about with you, because it seems like you make more announcements and do more scrums.
Have more trouble.
And have more trouble than any other Minister of the Crown. So, but, initially the request was to speak to you about the current I don't want to say obsession, but there is intensive scrutiny on the issue of bail and bail conditions, and and I think it's safe to say that the role that bail conditions play on how the justice system functions and its outcomes, it's an important topic, and you've had a lot to say about bail conditions. So I'll just to kind of get things going. So why bail conditions? Why has that become the current issue of interest for federal and provincial ministers of justice?
I mean, it's not the only area of interest, but it's something we started talking about last summer, and in particular as it relates to bail for those who have used bear spray or bladed weapons, knives. That was a particular concern in Manitoba, so we started to raise that last summer because we saw the issue really percolating in the province, that a lot of people who were committing violent crimes with those kinds of weapons were out on bail. So we didn't say that individuals shouldn't have the right to bail. We're just saying, reverse the onus, make it a little bit more challenging if they're using those type of weapons. Went to an FPT, a federal provincial meeting with other ministers of justice across Canada, held in Halifax in the fall of last year, and I want to raise this issue. And you followed some of these things before. Usually you get half the provinces agree and half the provinces say no, and maybe Quebec says, we're different, we're separate. But everybody agreed. Everybody says we have an issue, not necessarily just with bear spray or knives, but just said bail is a problem. And that shocked me, that surprised me, that everybody agreed, from NDP provinces in BC to other conservative governments. And from there, the Premier's issued a call. So I think it's both important, but it's also symbolic of what's happening, in that there's a lot of violent offenses. People are worried that individuals who should not have been released, who've already proven to be a danger to society, have been released. So it's a real thing. It's an obvious sort of issue, and it's one that's common across Canada. But it's not the only issue.
No, for sure. And you know, honestly, we had Minister Lametti on the show to talk about the Joyce and David Milgaard legislation, and in some future podcast, we'll sort of try to get because I know the reaction from provincial ministers of justice is going to be very interesting, because that if they do what they want to do, that's going to have a big impact on
and Minister Lametti has committed to taking action. He said he would do it before the end of this session of the Parliament. That's coming up in a few weeks, so we're holding him to his word that we'll see the text of that.
So getting back to bail, so the word reform bail has been used, and I think that, I mean, neither the federal government nor the provinces are speaking in specifics right now about how to, quote unquote, reform bail, whether it's going to be, you know, if it's going to be tougher to get bail, is it going to be tougher for everybody to get bail? Are we going to be more surgical and targeted? What does the term reform bail mean to you?
So I mentioned that fall meeting that we had last year in Halifax. That then sparked another meeting in Ottawa in March. And coming out of that meeting with a commitment that we got from the federal government was that they were in agreement with, if an individual had committed a violent offense and were given bail, and then they committed another violent offense, then there would be reverse onus. So a repeat violent offender would have a reverse onus for bail. It doesn't mean they can't apply for bail. It doesn't mean they can't get bail. It just means they have to demonstrate why it is that they won't be a danger to society. Also, and it didn't get as much attention, currently when it comes to bail, usually the judges will have to very formally demonstrate that the individual isn't going to be a danger to the person to whom they've committed an offense against. The other commitment we got from the federal government would be that they would change it, and so that the judge would also have to consider that they weren't a broader community danger. So not just to the individual. And why that's important is that, random attacks aren't always well covered when it comes to that kind of, when you're just looking at the individual and saying, is this individual who was previously attacked in danger? That doesn't speak well to random attacks where the community as a whole might be in danger. So that was another important commitment. So it was pretty surgical, repeat violent offenders and ensuring that there isn't a danger to the broader community.
So, okay, bail and anything that requires a prosecutor and a judge to make a decision on the level of threat posed by someone, like the contrary argument, or the argument, that maybe mitigates some of the interests that the ministers of justice have in this issue, is that, yes, there are people who offend, and some people do some really, really horrible things while out on bail, but that it is still fairly rare when you think of the enormous volume of people moving through the justice system. I'm not trying to say that any one tragedy involving someone out on bail isn't a reason to look at the system, but I think the counter argument has been, that it's a bit of a false flag argument, because you can make it tougher for people to get bail, but all you're doing is throwing more people into incarceration in a system that's already, in terms of the people being held in remand awaiting the disposition of their case, is already completely overwhelmed. Do you think there's anything viable about the argument that this is more political than it is really about making the justice system work well?
Well, I don't, in the sense that, and going back to the point that I made earlier, every province representing different political parties felt exactly the same way. And that's a very rare thing in Canada. When you have every provincial government, and they're never all the same political stripe, sitting around a table agreeing on air. That's a very rare thing in Canadian politics. So I don't believe it's political. I believe it's real, and I believe that individuals are hearing it in their individual provinces. It's not just a Manitoba problem. It's happening across Canada. And so, one of the strongest voices at that table was the NDP government in British Columbia, who was demanding bail reform. There's not a ton of things that I would agree with necessarily with the provincial NDP in BC. There are some, but on this one, absolutely in lockstep. And with other provinces as well, because it's not a small number.
You do, however, share one important.
Let's hear it.
You're governing, and that is the great equalizer. So if you're governing, and every province and every major city within every province, the in particular random attacks, random violence, particularly in the cores or downtowns of the city, like that is one of the current major concerns. So you guys all share the same political. You suffer the same political burden when this is happening, and the public is asking, like, what are you doing?
We suffer the same political problem, but that can be true in a lot of different things. And I mean, healthcare, there's going to be a lot of challenges, but there can be different approaches. And that's usually my experience at these tables is that, you all feel sort of have a common problem that's going on, but there's usually quite a bit of different approaches. On this one, everybody lined up and said, bail's an issue. And that it's rare that everybody sort of unifies around not a solution, because there's not a magic solution. There's not a magic bullet on any of this.
Right.
But everybody agreed that this had to be dealt with. So I don't think it's unified around politics.
So prior to this becoming a big issue, let's say in the last third of last year, this really sort of came into focus as the top of mind issue, it seemed, for justice ministers, or one of them. But if I had, and I do, if I had talked to judges and prosecutors and private bar lawyers about the problems with the bail system, the answer I would have got would have been completely different. What they would have told me, what they have told me, is that their biggest concern is that there are too many boilerplate provisions for when bail is granted. So the restrictions that are placed on an individual are, regardless of what offense they may be seeking bail on, are very, very similar. So there's prohibitions on drugs, prohibitions on alcohol, maybe associating with certain people. There might be restraining orders involved, those type of things.
Sure.
And so the biggest problem they would have identified was how the system is too sensitive in revoking bail on things that are don't represent a public threat. So somebody on bail who it does not demonstrate any substance abuse problem, but is told that they can't drink or use drugs. And so then what happens is on an unscheduled check, they're found that they had a beer. And the number of times that people get revoked and thrown back into the system creates a capacity issue. So is there, at the same time as we're looking at being surgical and targeted, are there not other mitigating, isn't there not another side of the coin that needs to be looked at here?
Sure. And I've never said that when it comes to dealing with the issue that we have with crime, that it's any one particular solution. The issue of bail was real. It was identifiable. It was something that I think the federal government could take relatively quick action on. But I've also never dismissed the fact that there are provincial things that need to be done as well. We've talked about that in terms of monitoring. So we talked about electronic monitoring and introducing a new program there.
Returning the program,
but it's new technology. So it's not the same program. Ensuring that there is more monitoring of individuals, making sure that there are more support for those who are out on either probation or bail. In the same way that, people say, well, you just want to put everybody in jail and what's that going to do? Well, we worked on our jail system, so we have therapeutic drug facilities in Headingley and the Women's Correctional Center. We're building healing lodges in a number of different provincial jails. So the doing time just doesn't have to be wasted time. I mean, I know that if somebody's in jail, just having them sit there and not, try to do anything that's going to prevent them from going back into their life that they got them into jail isn't helpful. So we're doing, both, and you can walk and chew gum at the same time on this. So yeah, we have to make sure that there's safety, and those who have demonstrated to be danger to the community need to be removed from the community. Those who need support need additional support, and those who are going to be in jail need to find some ability to try to get reformed in jail, and we're working on all three of those things.
And possibly, because I'm assured that the bail breaches or revocations are like that just creates a huge speed bump in the system. Like the courts and prosecutors, just like it's a constant concern. So like that's obviously maybe not the first time you've heard of a problem like that, but is that something like, would you sort of commit that anything that makes bail less available to certain kinds of people, crimes and circumstances, that on the other side, we're not revoking people for really casual reasons when really you're going to need the space, because invariably what you're talking about keeping more of these people in remand.
Well, right. And listen, I mean, so you're talking about two different challenges and maybe two different problems. But I'm, as the Minister of Justice, I'm not going to suggest that we shouldn't have the right kind of bail laws and the right kind of bail reform to keep the community safe because we don't have enough space or because it's going to cause other problems. Then the responsibility for me is to deal with those other problems. But we're not going to make a decision and say, well, we're going to let the community remain less safe and not push for bail reform because it's going to cause some downstream effect in the jail system where we need more space. If that's the case, then we'll develop more space. But the ultimately we have to do what's right for public safety, and then look at the downstream effects on that.
So is this the kind of thing that ultimately requires the federal government to enunciate this through the criminal code partly?
On bail reform?
Yeah.
Entirely.
Yeah.
So they need to make a criminal code change. Mr. Smitty has committed, not just to me, but to every provincial AG and to the premiers, that will come this spring. Spring is, well, I'm looking out my window here with you, Dan.
It's
and
almost completely
it feels
sprung.
like it's spring, right? The Bombers are in training camp, so we must be getting close to spring. But Parliament's going to recess in a couple of weeks, and so I'm expecting he's going to fulfill his commitment.
One of the things that some observers have pointed out is that this government did, however, ration some resources for community corrections and monitoring of people so that was the 2017 decision to end the ankle bracelet electronic monitoring program. And there has been mention of 160 positions in community and in custody corrections. The 2017 one I did find background that confirmed that. On the 160 positions, somebody's adding things together to come up with that number, but there's no doubt that there hasn't been, I think it's safe to say your government hasn't expanded or enhanced bail supervision or post-release supervision, community corrections since you've been in power. Like, let's talk about the 2017 decision. Yeah. So why get rid of the electronic monitoring program at that time?
So look at the legacy of that program, right? So me and you have been around a long time, Dan. When I got elected,
I don't know what you mean.
Well, okay, I'll be more definitive after the podcast. Well, I could be a bit more definitive now. When I got elected in 2003. There was a panel for new MLAs, and they had reporters come in to talk about dealing with the press, and you were on that panel.
Oh, good Lord.
I thought then already that you were sort of a stalwart of the media. But anyway.
Stalwart is an interesting, I've never heard that one. I can think of some synonyms, but we'll go with stalwart.
I could have thought of other things, but I'll stick with stalwart for the sake of, this is a children's show, right?
Yeah.
But listen, so we've been around a long time. I look at that program with the ankle bracelets. They started because of high-risk car thieves, right? I mean, that's when it came in. And that was sort of a mid-2000, 2008 issue, significant issue, somewhat dissipated because of monitoring, somewhat because of immobilizers, and somewhat because of other issues. But that was old technology. 2008 didn't change a lot. So it had to be a decision, I guess, about whether you moved to new technology. Was it particularly effective? The decision was made at that point to go away from it because that technology wasn't doing what it was doing in 2008. Now we've had some discussion with other provinces, other jurisdictions, it's changed significantly. I mean, in 5 years, you think about even how the phone that you're looking at right now has changed and the different technology that it has. One of the things, as an example, is that it's more proactive. And so if an individual is wearing some kind of a monitoring device for a domestic violence situation, it can actually indicate to the person to whom they've got an order against that individual is in a nearby proximity. And some of that can eliminate a threat, but sometimes it's just a small town issue, right? Where you're in the same grocery store, and you just, it's just good to be notified, this might be an unintended breach. So the technology is different. The environment's different in terms of increasing crime, so it made a lot of sense to bring it back.
Personal disclosure. So my mom was a federal parole officer, and I guess that when you have 3 boys and you're a single mom, that prepares you for a career in corrections. Go figure. But
you're not comparing the media to somebody who no,
you don't. What I'm saying is you don't know my brothers. But she also spent some time in provincial probation services in Ontario. Okay, so what I know is. Bail supervision, probation and parole services have never been the most supported part of the corrections system and justice system. Like it's always been kind of a poor cousin. Yeah. You've got law enforcement, then you have prosecutorial services, and then you have formal in custody corrections, and then all the stuff that comes out. It is kind of an afterthought. To really make the bail reform work, and you've put probation enhancements on that as well, you really are talking about taking a look at this part of the justice system that really, maybe you'll disagree that it's been underserved,
No, I don't know that I would disagree with that. So look, first of all, if you deal with that top end on bail, and you keep the people who should be incarcerated, that certainly helps people who are doing probation. But then everything in probation is a bit of a risk assessment, right? Because they're dealing with pretty big numbers of people that they're monitoring, and so they themselves are making judgments between, who's a higher risk and who's not a high risk. So the programs that we're enhancing are exactly those programs where probation officers or the Department of Justice is saying these folks have been granted probation or they're on bail, and we are deeming them to be a higher risk. So we're going to put both more support and more monitoring around them. So that is, those are judgment calls. Judgment calls happen in the justice system all the time. But if at the top end of it, you can stop individuals who shouldn't be being released from being released, that helps those in probation. But then we have to provide more support in there too. So is it, you defined it as the poor cousin or the forgotten part of the justice system. It maybe isn't as seen as much, the work that they're doing, until things go bad. And then it's known.
No, for sure. I think of it as well, though, too, that like the job of probation and parole has always been overwhelmed. Like they've never, my mom worked at one of the biggest community correctional facilities, Jane Center in Toronto, and not only was that's one of the busiest and densest places in the country, but all of the worst offenders that were subject to statutory release would end up resident there and would end up, sort of another file folder on the corner of my mom's desk and her colleagues. I think part of the problem as well too, and I'm interested in your perspective. People seem to conflate community corrections with being not so tough on crime. Like, that it's, if you have programming for people who've been released from jail, well, you're coddling them, or you're rewarding them for, or whatever. And I don't think you would disagree so much with the way the public might understand or misunderstand certain aspects of the justice system. But man, when you think of how closely related these things are to addiction and mental health, don't we have to kind of like throw the gauntlet down now and sort of say, like, we either care for these people, get them the help that they need, or else we are going to have random street attacks and random violence, and we're never going to escape it. Because these people, a lot of them never do anything bad enough to stay in jail for a long time, it seems, until they do something that's really, really bad.
I think that what happens when we discuss this sometimes in the media and in the public is that people move to an either-or camp. That it's either going to be you got to lock everybody up, or it doesn't help to lock anybody up. And I don't sort of prescribe to either worldview. I think that there are individuals who demonstrate that they are a danger to society. Bail reform is important on that. But if they're going to be in a provincial jail, we're putting in things we talked about, healing lodges and therapeutic communities that can provide that support when they're in jail to hopefully, when they get out, that they're not in the same position that when they went in. But we're doing significant things. And I think if you talk to some of the Grand Chiefs, we'll talk about some of the restorative justice initiatives that are happening, because it's both important, but I think it is different than the 90s. I mean, I think people recognize that there's a connection between homelessness, addiction, mental health. I mean, we've talked about even my own family, coming from a family of addiction. Dad was an addict, died when I was young as a result of that. Probably was some mental health issues in there as well, but we didn't talk about it that way in the 1970s. So I understand that part of it. I understand that you need to have that support. I consider myself, coming from a family that grew up in government housing, addictions in my family. My mom was a single mother. We share some of that experience. But for some community support, I might be in a very different place. And so I understand the importance of community support, but I don't think we need to fall into the trap of it's either this or that. I think we can do both. We need to ensure folks who shouldn't be, walking the streets aren't on the streets, but people who just need some support get that support.
Switching gears quickly, one of the other pressing issues you've been involved in is a continental discussion about what to do about irregular border crossings. And, the situation in the United States right now appears to be pure chaos. Now, a lot of the attention is on the southern border, but, there are pandemic restrictions that affected the flow of immigration have ended. And this has become this weird flare, like starting pistol for unheard of levels of irregular crossings and attempts. So the position, and it's not just you, it's a lot of the provinces have sort of said, well, Ottawa has to lead on this. Like, we want to be involved and do what we can, but Ottawa has to lead. Do we have an idea yet about what it is we're supposed to be doing to deal with this situation?
Well, they have to lead because they are responsible for the border, and they are responsible for immigration. So absolutely they have to lead. Part of the challenge is that the situation changes in different ways. So I was immigration minister in the province for a couple of years. I held most of the roles in government, it seems. And
you've had trouble keeping a job.
Yeah, I do have a hard time. I can't find one that people like me. You're okay with that?
There's a lot of people in politics have trouble keeping a job.
That's it. So. Yeah, thanks for that confidence, Dan. My self-esteem is dropping by the second. But at that time, when I was Minister of Immigration, of course, we had people coming from the States into Canada, right? It was during the Trump presidency and the challenges that were happening at that time. So we had the folks moving from the States trying to get into Canada, and now we're seeing more of an influx sometimes of people trying to go from Canada into the United States. And it has a lot to do with geopolitical issues and what's happening in the United States primarily at any given time. But it also, has to do with, how are we securing our borders? How are we ensuring that we're dealing with individuals? But we have on a provincial side, it's a little limited. Now, there are some things that we've taken, particular stands on. And as an example, Lloyd Axworthy came to this office and said to me, it's not right that individuals who are being, held on some sort of an immigration issue are held in a provincial jail when it's not a justice issue. They haven't been accused of a crime. They haven't been accused of being a danger. They just have some paperwork issues, and you're putting them in jail. So we wrote to the federal government and said, we're not going to do that anymore. That has to stop. And Lloyd Axworthy, different political party, but he was absolutely right, in terms of his comments. We've made some changes there. I've talked to the RCMP about border control and border patrol. Not from Canadian Border Services protection perspective, because that is federal, but just patrolling that area and what can we do? Because people are putting themselves at risk, right? If it, maybe not so much today, but in the middle of winter, and we saw the tragedy of that. What can we do on that side of it? More broadly, look, next month I'll be speaking with American officials again. I'm co-chairing, I have for about a decade, the Canada-U.S. Relations Committee for the Midwestern part of Canada and the United States. We're going to be meeting in Detroit talking about that issue. We're going on to looking at the Windsor. A lot of our discussion is often commercial, right? And the
For sure.
commercial trade. And how do you do pre-clearance in that? But there's a lot more discussion about border control from individuals.
So, would you also say though, because there were changes made to the third-party agreements, do we need to go back and take a look at, because it appears to be we're right in the middle of the law of unintended consequences. I don't think the U.S. anticipated when they made the request what the result has been. So even if they're not concerned about the impact it's having on Canada, they certainly should be concerned about the impact it's having on their own, jurisdiction. Do you think we need to go back and maybe discuss it again and find a better protocol?
Well, I mean, I think obviously what's happening now isn't working well. I think everybody can agree on that. Is this the top issue for President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau at this point? I don't know. But I mean, I think we need to talk about a lot of different things when it comes to the border. So you'll remember after 9/11, there was lots of discussion about sort of a North American kind of border security, and Harper was big on talking about that. And I think we need to maybe have some discussion about that again, right? I mean, how do we look at security? And that's more, security from a different perspective, but talk about that from a North American perspective. When we talk about trade, we demonstrated during the pandemic that even though the borders were closed to non-commercial travel, basically, the trade part worked really, really well. And about 98% of the goods that were moving continue to move. There were supply chain issues for a lot of different reasons. But in my role on that Canada-U.S. Relations Committee, we saw that continued to work well. But we haven't figured out, this issue of those who are using the border in an illegal or in a regular way. And I do think that the two prime minister and the president need to sit down and make this a bit of a priority.
Changing gears once again.
Yeah.
So many of the listeners of the podcast may not realize that when the first minister gets around to putting together his or her cabinet, they slot everybody into a portfolio. Yeah. And then there's a series of other responsibilities. Yeah. I like to call it the basket of hand grenades. And everybody gets a hand grenade, right?
I've had a few.
Yeah, hand grenade for you and hand grenade. So
you're not talking house leader, I don't think. I think it's probably going in a different direction.
No, because you like doing house leader.
Well, I do, but I've also done it for almost 15 years now. At some point, it's you sort of, the joy sort of dissipates a bit.
No, I'm thinking mostly of the minister responsible for Manitoba Public Insurance.
Yeah.
So, and there's a lot of periods where that wasn't really a hand grenade.
You're saying I'm bad luck.
Well, I don't think it's your fault.
Oh, thanks. Good. Mark that down.
But okay, so this year has seen a series of revelations at Manitoba Public Insurance. Also, starting last year in hearings at the Public Utilities Board. Essentially, if I can summarize very quickly, there have been some controversial things done. The Information Technology Project Nova is $200 million over budget, and its completion and fate is still somewhat up in the air. There have been some controversial business decisions made around untendered contracts, around hiring. And then most recently, the Free Press reported about the CEO's decision to award himself performance bonuses and a fairly generous number of days traveling on business. I don't really want to go into the weeds on all of that stuff, but what
you just did.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm going to trim the lawn a little bit. No, I think the bigger question that we haven't really had a chance to discuss, and we have talked about some of these stories, is kind of the issue of like what is government's role in the oversight of a Crown entity. The CEO, Mr. Herberlin, made a comment that he met with you on a fortnightly basis.
Might have been an over-exaggeration.
Well, as hyperbole,
yeah.
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah.
So, but that he met with you on a regular basis.
Sure.
And assured you that So I guess the first question is, do you feel that he was being completely forthright about some of the stuff? Because I think that after you learned some of the details of what was going on, you were forced, you issued directives, you issued public cautions. So can we assume that you weren't the normal channels? you weren't necessarily getting all the information you needed.
So one step back, Crown corporations and their interrelation with government is challenging and difficult. It's probably even difficult for the media from a reporting perspective, because Crown corporations are essentially independent of government, and yet you have a minister who's responsible primarily for the act. So I'm responsible for the MPI Act, but I'm still accountable. I may not be responsible for every decision, but I'm accountable to speak to every decision that happens. The frustrating part sometimes as a minister, when you're a minister of a department, you tend to see things as they work their way up, and you can, put a little bit more influence in terms of what's coming. With Crown corporations, you often find out after the fact, or you didn't have a lot of input into the decisions, because the boards are really working with the CEOs, and you're relying on information coming that they think is pertinent to come to maybe beforehand. But on the other hand, you've probably, Dan, in your 50 years of journalism, whatever it's been.
That hurt. That really hurt.
Probably half the stories have been that government's interfering too much with Crown corporations, the other half that they're not interfering enough. And it is a difficult balance, right? So you're trying to, and as a minister, it's sometimes frustrating because you find out about things that you might not agree with, but you didn't have a lot of input into the decision. So we're trying to ensure that there's better communication in terms of hearing about things in advance, so there can be more input in advance, so the government can provide some of its own perspectives. Ultimately, the board and the corporations are going to make decisions, but government should be able to provide perspective because it's a Crown corporation.
Right.
It's not a private corporation. There's a public responsibility. I've got to answer to the fact that why is the Crown corporation hiring 400 more people, which I disagreed with at the time, and had to sort of push back on some of that. Untendered contracts, sort of heard about that perhaps in a more timely way. Because I have concern about untendered contracts. Not that there aren't sometimes reasons for them. Emergencies, there's nobody else to do the job. But we shouldn't be finding out about those things, pretty late in the game. So that's been some of my concern. Project Nova, I think, I've continued to get updates on it. I personally think it's on a timeliness path that's deliverable. I think it's on a financial path that's deliverable. But still, we need to ensure that we're hearing about these things in a more timely way. So do I meet with the CEO? I've met with the CEO, but meetings are meetings. But you need to hear about things at those meetings that are relevant and important. And as you know, sometimes in government, it's not what you're told, it's what you're not told. And if you're not always sure, where to ask those questions, that can be a challenge as a minister in a department, but you figure that out pretty quickly as a minister. It's particularly hard in a Crown corporation because they are operating independently. Yeah,
no, for sure. And it is fairly represented that it is not, the interactions are not clearly defined. They are defined, but there are a lot of gaps in the definition that don't account for certain situations. I was told that government is CC'd on all materials that are tabled at board meetings. The board is has undertaken and completed, is what I know now, a review of the performance of the CEO. So I guess my question is, and I understand that no one feels comfortable talking about the contents of it, but can you tell me, have you seen it?
I've not seen it.
Okay.
I expect to. I understand there was a review undertaken for a variety of different reasons. Maybe 3 months ago or so. I've not seen the contents of it. I expect to see it. As you might not know, there's a new chair of the board. The former chair stepped down a couple of days ago. So government's appointed a new chair to Manitoba Public Insurance. That's not public yet, but Dan, because we've been together for a long time, I can tell you that the new chair will be Ward Keith, who was vice president of MPI for a couple of decades, perhaps, long time anyway. And that was, first of all, I want to say, Mike Sullivan, who tendered his resignation a couple of days ago, he'd been chair for a long time, and probably longer than most chairs of Crown corporations. So I appreciate the work that he's done, and that's challenging. And I had good discussions with Mike, and I know he did his best in some challenging situations over the last couple of years. But with his resignation, we needed somebody who could sort of quickly step in, understand the organization, understand the role of a Crown corporation. So Ward Keith agreed to do that role. Government agreed with his appointment. So it's official already, but I guess it'll be public, well, either on Tuesday or whenever you report it.
I think that the remaining questions that exist in this story, as it's seen as a political story, is sort of, how and when does the minister responsible for MPI get involved? And this is tangentially connected to the review the board did, but is there, do you believe, if you felt it was necessary in any Crown corporation that you were responsible for, that if there needed to be a change in executive leadership of any of the Crowns, that is an issue that you can fairly and legally take up, but directly with the board of directors?
So the board of directors makes the decision on the CEO. That's how it's established. But I think what I've demonstrated over the last many months that I've been the minister, and maybe even in government, generally, I'm not worried about taking action when I think it's the right thing to do. So 2 ministerial directives in the last few months, reappointed a government MLA back to the board to try to draw that connection, and a strong government MLA to try to draw that connection. Just told you we've appointed a new board chair. I don't think that I've have a reputation of being shy to take action when I think it's necessary to take action.
Fair enough. Minister Goertzen, Kelvin, thank you very much for the time. I will say, reporters love to complain about not having access to people, and much, I'm sure, to the chagrin of some of your co-workers, you've always been available and always been pretty frank and forthright in interviews, so that is always appreciated. Nigan's going to really hate himself for missing this one, which in an odd way makes me feel good. And so thanks for doing this, and I'm sure we're going to be speaking to each other more.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I've said this before. Listen, I've been around for 20 years in elected life, and a little bit before that in this building in different roles in the 90s. I don't agree with everything you write, Dan. I don't agree with everything every reporter writes. But I think that we've always had a respectful relationship. I think I've always been able to say if I didn't agree with something. I think it's always been, because I understand the media has a role, has an important role in a democracy. And I worry about the state of our democracy. Maybe that's a discussion for a different broadcast or a different podcast. But I value the role that the media has, and I think you value the role that we have. And so that's an important place to start.
So you heard it here first. The second Friday of every month will be the Kelvin Goertzen and the Lone Ranger Show.
We're going on the road to Smitty's.
That's right.
And
that's
Chicken
right.
Chef. Chicken Chef too.
Chicken Chef too, yeah. Kelvin, thanks a lot again. And best of luck with all of the things we talked about.
Thanks very much.
What a great interview with Justice Minister Kelvin Goertzen, who one thing I really appreciate is not only does he have a great deal of experience in politics, I mean, even being involved with the Reform Party at one time, but that he's able to sort of stretch the different realms within that movement. I mean, even supporting Stuart Murray in the past, there is a real interesting dynamism in kind of Kelvin Goertzen's conservatism that I think is worth noting and seen a lot during that interview.
Well, and as he underlined in the interview, he's not exactly the guy you think he is. He is, in some respects, exactly the guy you think he is. And he doesn't hide his conservatism. He doesn't hide his faith, which is a big, there's a big interface there. But I think when you think about his life experience and the fact that he grew up in rather difficult circumstances, father was an alcoholic, mother, a single mother, and that he grew up in a family that required, support of government to make ends meet. It does kind of show you that when you get to meet people in politics, they are more complex than the characters they play on TV, so to speak. So, it was a good get for us. We're a better podcast for having him on.
Oh, for sure. And I just want to say, the kind of array of different people over the past few weeks that I think has been really indicative of that Manitoba politics is very dynamic and interesting, but also B, that there's this wide array of opinions of people who care deeply about this place, and I really like that we've been able to give a good span recently. But we've reached yet near the end, and we want to thank our producer Adam and all the good folks at CJNU, and also huge thanks to all of our colleagues at the Free Press and great work that they're doing over there, and Wendy Sawatsky and Paul Samin and the great people who support us. Also, a big thanks as always to our families and to those who stand up for us and encourage us, especially when we go through the ups and downs of being in this podcast world and the media world. And I especially want to thank you, my good brother on the podcast, for carrying some of this heavy lifting. I know that I've been on the road a lot. So
Yeah, no worries. And I dream of a day when we can be back together.
Next week.
Yes.
Yeah, next week.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.
All right, Miigwech.